Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Bridgehead. My name is Jonathon Van Maren, and I'm so glad you're all listening again. Now, today, I'm going to talk with somebody that I met just a week and a half ago. Some of you will know from following my blog at thebridgehead.ca or the columns I write for LifeSite News. I was recently at the Coalition to End Sexual Exploitation Summit in Houston, Texas, and it was a really fascinating experience because, of course, I do a lot of anti-porn work at an organization called Strength to Fight, which is based out of Ottawa, but there are those of us who do speaking on pornography across Canada. And it was the first time I really got to meet literally hundreds of people who are working against sexual exploitation in all of its different forms. And a lot of experts on pornography were there. Some of you will know I recently wrote a book called The Culture War, so I'm quite up to date on the most recent anti-porn research. And it was really interesting to get to meet a lot of the academics that I had quoted in my book and a lot of the people whose work I had just spent months poring over and taking notes on. And there was a lot of other people there as well. What was most interesting, if I had to really pinpoint it, from this conference was the huge variety of different backgrounds of the people that were there. The anti-porn issue really is an ecumenical one, and people are coming at it from all different kinds of reasons. So you have the feminist critiques by people like Dr. Gabe Deem, and of course her rape culture arguments would be something that I myself would agree with. Then you've got, of course, people coming at it from the Christian point of view, the Catholic point of view. Of course, Fight the New Drug was founded by Mormons in Utah. So you have just a whole different range of beliefs. And then, of course, you have the non-religious angle of it. You have a lot of people that are increasingly coming out and speaking against pornography because, from their perspective, pornography just basically did a lot to ruin their life. And one guy from Reboot Nation he gave a very interesting presentation. His name was Gabe Deem. And I'm not going to tell you too much about him because he's going to tell us his story in just a moment. But he was part of a group of people that was at this conference who weren't coming from a religious perspective, not coming from any kind of ideological perspective like Dr. Gabe Deem would. He was just talking about how porn affected him. And that's one of the reasons his story, I think, is quite compelling, because you start to realize that porn is toxic and porn is poisonous, aside from the fact that pornography often highlights horrific and degrading ways of representing women and calling them awful names, and besides the fact that it's the number one relationship destroyer now in North America, aside all of that, there are still yet more reasons that you should stay away from porn, and that's because porn is actually physically unhealthy. So Gabe Deem agreed to join us from Texas, and this is that conversation. So let's start off. Tell our listeners a bit about your story. How did you get into the anti-porn movement, of all things?
Well, I grew up with unlimited access to porn. I found a Playboy magazine when I was 8. I was watching cable porn at 10 years old and internet porn at 12, and I watched internet porn for a decade. And it eventually led me to a time when I was around 23 years old. I went to have sex with a beautiful girl I was really attracted to, and my body couldn't function at all. I couldn't get an erection no matter what we tried, or despite the fact that I was really attracted to her. So I did what anyone would do. I got on Google and I started searching for answers, and I eventually found forums with thousands of teenagers and 20-year-olds with the same problem. They had used internet porn for several years, and then they no longer could be aroused by their partner. And so that kind of caught me off guard. I had never heard that porn could have a negative effect. Never really cared about my porn use, or I wasn't ashamed of my porn use. I just thought it would be awesome to use a lot of porn, and it would make me better at sex. So once I realized it had the opposite effect, I was like, oh my gosh, the world needs to know that this is a potential problem for, young kids that are using it. And I was also seeing, posts from young guys all over the internet that were, they were desperate for help, seeking and searching answers. They'd go to the doctor, and the doctor would tell them, it's all in their head. If they were young with erectile dysfunction, the doctor would tell them it's probably just performance anxiety. And so I noticed that, the potential negative effects of porn needed to be, known to the world. And so that's kind of what led me to speaking up and sharing my story. So, yeah.
Now, what's interesting about that is I have Facebook, like most of the listeners, and I've seen probably dozens of articles now from Salon.com, Huffington Post, Slate. I read one in The Independent the other day about a study that said porn actually makes people more feminist and is healthy for your sex life. So it shouldn't be surprising that a lot of people think that porn is at best, or at worst, harmless. But obviously that's not the case. So where is this alternative case coming from?
Well, I mean, like you said, there's been a lot of mainstream media saying porn's super healthy for the last 20 years, and that's what my friends and I found when we were kids. I watched several TV shows around the age of 11, 12, 13, where, like the Howard Stern show, or maybe some late-night sex talk show where they had a sexologist on there saying porn will spice up the bedroom and stuff like that. But the alternative viewpoints coming from us, young guys who grew up consuming porn all through our adolescence, and it ended up screwing us up, and we're now dependent on porn to even function sexually. And then not only that, we recover after we quit porn. I regained my sexual function, and the same story is true for thousands of other guys. So now, historically speaking, people that spoke up against porn had a moral argument against it, but that's not the case where I'm coming from and where a lot of these young guys are coming from. We thought it would be sex positive, but it ended up completely destroying our sex lives and being sex negative.
Well, and that's what's sort of interesting, because there are a lot of cases against porn. There's the case that people make that it degrades the people in it. There's the case that feminists like Gail Dines would make that it fuels rape culture. There's, of course, the moral case against porn. But you're coming at this from an almost exclusively scientific perspective based on your experience that, porn screwed you up, as you say, and then when you remove that variable, you recovered. So how do you respond in debates to people who say, well, the evidence, the studies that we have are basically disqualify your story from being taken seriously by people in the discussion about pornography?
Well, I don't know what evidence they would be referring to. We have now over 20 studies on, brain studies on porn users, and all of those studies point to the possibility of porn addiction being a real thing. And even the studies that, there's one study, or two now actually, that the researcher claimed disproves porn addiction. But, there's been 5 or more reviews by other neuroscientists that actually say that her findings align with the porn addiction model. So if you look at it, all evidence supports the possibility of porn addiction. And then on the topic of porn-induced sexual dysfunctions, we now have 3 different studies that had case studies where young guys had erectile dysfunction that was unexplained by any other variable, and they had them remove porn use, and they all recovered. I think the only exception where the guys didn't recover are the guys that couldn't quit watching porn. So if you look at the evidence, it all supports what I'm saying in my experiences, and it definitely needs to be studied more. But, yeah.
So here's an interesting thing, because the idea of porn addiction, the word addiction is often what's debated, and you've got people like Dr. Marianne Layden saying that, porn functions just like a drug, and I know you've done a lot of research into this. Explain to our listeners how porn actually does function very similarly to drugs.
Well, there's several addiction-related brain changes that are seen in all addictions. You have sensitization, which can be summed up as a super memory of pleasure, like Pavlov's dog that wires his brain for a stimulus, which can lead to hypersensitivity to cues, and that's been shown in several studies, such as the 2014 Cambridge study. So that's sensitization, which can be it's just wiring your brain for porn. And then the other one is desensitization, which is numbing your brain to all pleasure. And this is seen in like a decline in dopamine receptors, for example. And there's Simone Kuhn, a researcher from Germany. She found that in her study. And then there's hypofrontality, which is a brain change that it basically explains a lack of decision-making, inhibited decision-making, if you will, and it's in the prefrontal cortex of the brain. And that's been seen in several studies, too. So those are the main brain changes that happen in substance addictions like alcohol, cocaine, And obviously, to be fair, there's additional brain changes that happen with substances, but those same brain changes happen with behaviors, which is why gambling has been seen as a serious addiction. And now, tons of research is rolling out on video games, internet addiction, and porn addiction as well. And they all have similarities.
Now, for somebody who's listening and, using porn, even if it's casually or, that porn use is escalating, kind of walk them through what will happen to their brain as they begin to shift from casual porn use to compulsive porn use.
Yeah, so, it can happen a couple different ways. A porn user can escalate in both duration of use, where you start to watch for longer and longer periods of time, or you can escalate how I escalated, and I became hooked on the novelty that it provided. So, instead of watching, 1 or 2 clips per session, I was watching compilation videos, which, thanks to YouTube, porn sites now mimic YouTube, and they have unlimited videos that you can stream for instantly and have multiple tabs open at the same time, multiple windows playing 5 or 6 videos while you search for another one in another window. And the novelty that a porn addict can have is just out of this world and something we haven't been able to experience before. And then you can also escalate in genre, where, the porn that you're watching becomes boring as you habituate yourself to it or become desensitized, and then you need a bigger neurochemical hit, and you start watching stuff that's more shocking, maybe anxiety-producing or something that you fear, just to give your brain that bigger neurochemical hit, and then you escalate into more shocking material.
Now, it's interesting because, we just met at this conference in Houston, Texas last weekend, and there was a huge combination of different perspectives on this, right? There was feminists there, Christians, atheists, non-religious, and pretty much everything in between. But what I find interesting that both you were saying, as well as Alexander Rhodes of nofap.com, is that hundreds of thousands of guys are now talking about this on internet forums. And, both of you guys mentioned that guys are getting suicidal as they realize that in their early 20s, they seem to be broken already, that, this is not something that traditionally happens to people in that age category. Why is there not more discussion on this? Because it seems like it would be difficult to ignore hundreds of thousands of guys, probably even more than that, because these are just numbers that you guys are aware of. So there's probably a lot who aren't really thrilled to talk about, being a 22-year-old with ED. Why is this not being noticed more? Because especially in a quote-unquote sex-positive culture, this seems like the kind of thing that would make the news here and there.
Yeah, and I'm pretty frustrated that it's not talked about more. There's only a handful of guys that are speaking up with their faces to this now. And I think in just the last 2 years, we have seen a drastic increase of mainstream exposure to the topic. So, for instance, Time Magazine did a cover story that featured myself, Alexander, and Noah Church. And then, MTV was interested. You had Chelsea Handler on Netflix, and several other mainstream media outlets picked it up. So we have seen an increase just in the last 2 years, and that's only, I've only been speaking up for the last 2 or 3 years myself. So I'm a little optimistic that as we keep raising awareness, more and more people will talk about it. But I think another reason it hasn't been talked about much is because there's not a whole lot of research on the porn-induced sexual dysfunctions. But that's been rolling out in the last year. And it just takes a little while, I think, for journalists and producers to want to buy into a topic and cover it, because they probably fear they're going to be attacked because of, like you said, this pornified culture that we live in. A lot of people are skeptical, and they want very solid proof before you start talking about something in, a very serious media outlet kind of way. And so I don't know. I think with time, the conversation will grow, especially as more and more young guys speak out. And reality is going to win in the end, because you have so many young people suffering, so many relationships being torn apart. And I get messages from teenagers every day that, like you said, are suicidal, or they're just desperate for help. And a lot of therapists and urologists that are working with these young guys are starting to speak up. So I think it's just going to have a snowball effect, and eventually no one will be able to ignore it anymore.
Yeah, I was going to ask you that because you've said before that you were kind of at the beginning of the porn generation, right? The first generation that grew up with access to this kind of stuff. So, in a way,
I was like 11 when high-speed internet came out back in 1999.
So right at the very tip, and basically, the first porn generation, as I've heard it called before. Is it true that the research isn't there yet simply because there's a massive tsunami of guys affected by this that just haven't come out yet?
Yeah, I think, let's look at the order of events. So right after YouTube came out and the porn site switched to streaming videos, and that's really what upped the ante of the novelty, you had an explosion of guys on forums around 2008 start popping up. And Norman Doidge wrote in his book back in 2007 that he started seeing this first wave of guys showing up with erectile dysfunction and low libido for their real-life partners. And it's only increased since then. Philip Zimbardo gave a TED Talk in 2011 pointing this out, that a growing number of young guys are losing their motivation for life and their ability to function sexually with women. And it is growing and growing and growing. And now that it's hard to ignore, you've had 3 case studies come out in just the last 2 years, having urologists work with these young guys and remove porn use and see them recover. So, yeah, I think in the next couple of years you'll see more and more studies coming out because the urologists and the guys that are seeing this increase in young men, they're the ones that are going to have to raise the alarm and let everyone know that this is a real thing. And it's encouraging to know that just this past year, the American Urology Association, I believe it's what it's called, there was a presentation dedicated to porn-induced ED, and that was a talk given to a room full of urologists. So they are aware of it, and they are going to be increasingly speaking out about it.
Yeah, and that was interesting because last weekend in Houston, neurosurgeon David Lifton actually put up a picture of the Big Six tobacco executives and said that one day those academics who insist on defending pornography are going to be seen the same way we saw those who defended big tobacco and claimed that there were no adverse health effects from tobacco. And I know that you've tangled with a couple of the what David Lifton called porn profs yourself. What sorts of interactions have you had with them?
Well, first off, I'll just say I disagree completely with what they say. I think most of the people, it's a vocal minority. The people that are speaking up and saying that I'm full of misinformation and that we're making our stories up, I think their talking points are easily refuted. And so the interactions that I've had, they usually just shut down conversation and debate because they don't have answers. For instance, I've been blocked on Twitter by several of them and refused to go on shows with me and stuff like that. So I don't approach the topic as me versus the industry. I don't even consider myself anti-porn. I actually consider myself just pro-education.
Right.
And so it's pretty telling when the people that are against me won't even engage in conversation with me because they can't answer my, facts and scientific studies that I give them. They just, run away and shut down conversation. So I don't know. I would like to see more dialogue moving forward, but so far I've seen one side claiming that we're liars, but they won't engage in debate with us.
Now, this is interesting because one name crops up all the time. At the Coalition to End Sexual Exploitation Summit last weekend, 4 separate speakers, including yourself, mentioned one name, David Ley. And I started taking a look at all of these articles pumping up porn as a really good thing, and I realized that he's the main guy that they quote every single time because he wrote the book The Myth of Sex Addiction. And you were telling us the other night about your tangle with him on the Katie Couric show and the response to the things that he was saying. Tell us a bit about that, because I found that interaction very revealing of his ability to refute testimonies by people like yourself.
Yeah, that was a pretty fun show. So, first of all, myself and another guy shared our stories of how porn affected us. And we both said we were exposed at 8. And then right after that, Katie Couric asked him about, should 8-year-olds be exposed to porn? And he said, well, first of all, that's a myth. 8-year-olds aren't exposed to porn, which I found pretty funny because we just said we were. And then another thing, I shared my story of how porn, led to erectile dysfunction. And then his response on the show was, there's no evidence for that. And then what's funny about that is they just talked about the Cambridge 2014 study that reported 60% of the subjects had erectile dysfunction with their partners, but not with porn. So that was funny to me. And then she just pressed him. She pressed him, do you think it's okay that kids should watch porn? And he would not answer her yes or no. He wouldn't do it. And I believe that's because he knows that if he admits that kids shouldn't watch porn, he has to answer why. Like, why shouldn't kids watch porn? And so it's just interesting that he doesn't want to admit that. And I don't know. I feel like that's the most telling thing, is that he's so caught up in his agenda to promote his book and his career and all his talking points that he won't even admit that little kids shouldn't watch porn. The only answer he gave later on after the show was in a Psychology Today blog post, and he just said, they shouldn't watch it because it's adult entertainment. Right. That's all he said.
Well, it's kind of interesting because Dr. Gail Dines was telling us about how she was laying a lot of this evidence out at a debate in Australia, and just as Leigh responded to you, a bunch of the people on the panel said things to her like, those are just anecdotes, those stories mean nothing, and she said suddenly throughout the crowd, all these people started standing up and saying, I'm an anecdote, I'm an anecdote, I'm an anecdote, and kind of proving that, a lot of anecdotes end up creating data points, proving a wider trend. And I believe that you said that a lot of the people commenting on that debate actually pointed out that David Leigh was lying because their experience actually reflected your own.
Yeah. The whole audience during that show was, just baffled that he would not say that little kids shouldn't watch porn. And then also, if you look at the comment sections on the YouTube video and other videos, it's just full of guys saying, well, he doesn't know what he's talking about, I'm addicted. And that goes back to kind of what I was saying. I think reality is winning because our generation grew up with porn, and we all know that it can influence our sexuality, and we all know it can have a negative impact, especially the big chunk of us that were addicted or experienced dysfunctions. I think if you look at the reactions that people have now, it's different than it was 10 years ago because now you have a bunch of 20-somethings and 30-somethings that grew up with it, and we know reality.
Now, let's focus a little bit on some of the more encouraging stuff. I know you refer to Dr. Norman Doidge in his book, The Brain That Changes Itself, pretty often in your presentations, and I do talks in pornography quite a bit as well, and a lot of times I'll have guys ask me, can my brain recover from this? And of course, that's a sort of a question of neuroscience to some degree. So maybe you can explain, to give hope to those who are listening, who use pornography, the neuroscience behind how their brain can actually evolve back to factory settings, as you will.
Yeah, there's tons of hope. First off, let me say, I recovered, and I've seen thousands and thousands of guys recover. I've been monitoring forums for about 5 years now, and there's been so many guys that were absolutely hopeless, suicidal, that ended up coming out completely healthy and fine. So let me just say that first. But as far as the brain, we know that it can regain sensitivity. We know that neuroplasticity is alive and well our entire lives. That book that Norman Doidge wrote is phenomenal. Just the stories in there are incredible if anyone's interested. But you can regain sensitivity, and your sensitized pathways over time will weaken. And then you can also regain the control in your frontal cortex and your frontal lobes. So the brain's just really phenomenal. And I've noticed myself that my decision-making's gotten better as I've stayed away from porn. My sensitivity to all things sexual has increased. And like I said, I can function again. So my, conditioned arousal pathways in my brain have weakened clearly. Not to get too specific because I'm not a neuroscientist, but the brain can change and there's always hope. And we're seeing it play out in guys that have severe erectile dysfunction. We're talking teenagers, and they're recovering over several months of abstinence. And it's pretty beautiful if you ask me. And it's not just sexual function. You get mental clarity, increased motivation, increased empathy and compassion, and it's just, the benefits are pretty phenomenal and endless.
So from your perspective, just as sort of a final thing to the listeners, give them a bunch of reasons that they shouldn't watch porn besides what you've already just highlighted to them.
Yeah, well, first of all, I like to tell guys that porn took for me the one thing that I thought it would give me, and that's the ability to experience sexual pleasure. And then also, there's no amount of porn that can ever love you back. So for the guys that are, turning to porn because of a lack of a relationship, it's never going to fulfill them and be able to give them that connection. But then also, sex is better without porn, in my experience and opinion. I have more sensitivity. I connect with my partner more deeply. I enjoy the overall experience more. So, my approach is, there's nothing more sex negative than porn. It's completely pleasure focused. I think that staying away from porn is the best thing a young guy can do if he wants to have a great, sexual experience with his partner.
And so one last message, where can guys go to get a lot of this information? Because I know Gary Wilson is somebody you mention a lot, but for guys out there who are like, okay, this discussion really clarified a lot of the neuroscience for me, and it kind of explains a bit of what's been happening to me, where can they go to find the kind of information you've been telling us about?
Yeah, well, I always point people to Your Brain on Porn, and that's Gary Wilson's site. There's a lot of informational videos on there and articles that are pretty easy to understand, and I think that's a great place to start. And if you want help, encouragement, and support, or just if you want to read people's stories, or if you maybe want to share your story yourself, you can check out my site, rebootnation.org. Or there's other forums out there like nofap.com, yourbrainrebalance.com. The main point is there's information that's easily digestible, and there's also so much support if you want it. And I would encourage everyone to at least, whether you think you're addicted or not, just to experience what life is like without porn, because a lot of guys haven't done that. We've used porn since we were little kids. So just try and go without it. If you find it difficult, or if you notice any changes, that's a pretty clear sign that you've been affected by it, and you'll probably end up reaping the benefits that I've described that myself experienced.
Well, Gabe, thanks so much for taking the time to talk to us.
Yeah, thanks for having me, man.